Oh yeah, because he's just going to pick you up. You may want to move. Do you have me on that Gen page? I'm not doing that. Someone else is doing that. What? Oh, moving things? Oh, I see. Press over and pen. Oh, all right, got you. See me on.
Do you want to go before or after? I was going to go after. Hello, everybody. You ready to get started? All right, so just FYI before we start, if you haven't seen our camera we set up for live streaming, it's kind of nifty. It does a 360 view. So if someone asks a question, it'll actually intelligently look at you. So hopefully you're all comfortable being on video. You might not be, but you might get picked up in the background.
Sign here.
But yeah, exactly.
I can maybe next time.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so welcome back, BendJS. Glad to have everybody here. First one kind of the fall season, so we got a few more lined up, a couple announcements kind of before we get started. The next couple months, we're still working on a little bit of what we're going to do, but those should be announced here pretty soon. And in December, we're looking again to do another kind of all-tech Bend social night. I don't know how many of you actually made it to the one last month. It was a lot of fun. We did it in the Navis parking lot, had about 75, 80 people there. And that was on like 2-3 weeks notice for all the other meetups. So hopefully we'll do a lot bigger one. Still looking for a place to do it where we can get a bunch of people in. But that's kind of all leading to potentially next year doing a conference, and that's something we've been working kind of hard on. We've really decided we want to pursue. So if anyone has any thoughts on that, has an experience with managing one or being involved in planning one, I'd love to hear from you, because that's something we're still kind of feeling our way through the dark on. So hit me up, or any of us, me, Adam, Chris, whoever, up on the Slack channel. One more announcement is October. In October, we are going to be doing, working with the city of Bend to do a Hacktoberfest. So I don't know how many of you have ever been involved in the Hacktoberfest kind of nationwide thing. But we're going to be doing kind of a local one. So we partnered with the city of Bend. I actually have a meeting with the Chief Innovation Officer of the city of Bend on Friday morning to go over a couple projects they might want us to work on. They're going to be putting forward a bunch of swag that they'll give away to anyone who wants to contribute to these projects. We'll have more details shortly on how to get involved, how to actually contribute, but kind of mixing that, civic duty with actually doing some code on working on an open source project, getting involved kind of with the city and with the open source community. And so hopefully that'll be a really fun thing that we can all work on. More information will be posted in Slack as we kind of get closer to that, but that'll be Hacktoberfest Bend Edition. Before we get started, just want to say thank you to all our speakers. We got 8 of them tonight, kind of a wide range of topics, so it should be really fun. A lot of cool things, a lot of cool people to hear from. So, final thing before we get started, just thanks again to CodePen for sponsoring the beers and always using this space. Actually, we got some new people moving in, Repair Cube. Those of you guys back here, so we're using your space too. But definitely thanks for sponsoring the beers, Chris. And the CBT Nuggets for always getting the pizza and keeping this thing alive. So without further ado, as long as I didn't miss anything. So we'll start off with Paul. And it's not on here yet. We'll have to figure out how to do this. But because we have 8 speakers, we're going to want to move through them. So we're going to have like 10-minute timers. And you got to stick to that.
Is that working?
It says 18 minutes.
No, it says 6:30.
Oh, 6:30. Okay, so you have till 6:40.
30 plus 10.
All right, here we go. I'm winging this. So this is build tracker. You're going to look at this and say, I have no idea what I'm looking at. It's just a pretty graph. It does a bunch of things. Maybe. What this is I got some motivation about
2 years ago, maybe it was a year ago, I don't remember. We were having an issue in which the client-side JavaScript that we were sending to the browsers was getting too large as an overall package that our users were having to download. You can imagine if anybody uses React, as soon as you pull in React DOM, you're already looking at like, 40, 60 kilobytes or something like that of dependencies. So the idea is to try and keep everything down to a minimum as much as you can to do your users a service and yourself a service, because the faster that you can load everything for your users, probably the more likely they are to actually stay on your site and continue using it. So I built this application. This is a fully open source thing. You can use it now. It's still alpha, basically just because I need to still deploy this new version of it. I had written it once before and I hated it, so I rewrote it, as a lot of people end up doing a lot, especially with open source things. So this is basically it. I want to quick walk through what I'm looking at, and feel free to just shout out, ask any questions as we're going. But so basically what we're looking at across the bottom here are get SHAs. So each one of these is a commit. We actually call them builds because it doesn't always necessarily track every build or every commit, but it will track every build that you send it. And so if we dig in here, we can actually see there's a pretty big jump in size from this commit to this commit. We can actually take in and look at that. And on the right-hand side here, we actually end up with this really handy-dandy chart. And it shows all kinds of different things happening. And when we hover over that, we can actually see that, oh, this file actually got added because before it was nothing and now it's 3 kilobytes. 3 kilobytes, not that bad. But what I actually really wanted to do more than anything was be able to group things together. So I can actually go and hide everything else. So I can actually just look at the web application and I can see the overall size of what the users have to download if they use the entire application. And this is actually build tracker tracking itself. So all of these assets are loaded on this page right now. So I thought that was actually kind of cool. So anytime I push to GitHub, it actually pushes another build up here and we'll analyze it as we go. So I'm going to change this actually to, I actually didn't want that. Most recent 60 builds, you can actually see them going across here. And this is still just the web app we're looking at. But when we actually start to dig in, we get all of a sudden this this exclamation point over here. If I can make it bigger. And it says, uh-oh, error. Web app failed the gzip budget size limit of 146 kilobytes. Actually, it's a kilobyte, by 4.21 kilobytes. Why are we doing this? So what is a budget? A budget is something that, if anybody listens to like Chrome Dev Summit or the Google Lighthouse performance team, what they talk about all the time, my phone just responded to me saying Google. Thank you. They talk about performance budgeting quite a bit. And what that means, simply, is that, I don't really have a good example there. We set a budget for the size of our application. Build Tracker goes one step, actually 2 steps further, and you can set 3 different types of budgets on what you're doing. And it looks like I lost it. There it is. So, well, actually, there's multiplied by 2. So you can set a warning or an error. I found the need for a warning actually pretty important because sometimes it is actually like okay that things are progressing along in a certain direction, but we do want to call that out. So I thought it was nice to have a warning. But the 3 budget types that you can deal with then are a total size. So we have a size budget type. A delta, so that's a size delta, increasing by 4 kilobytes. You can say, I don't want this file to increase by more than 4 kilobytes for any one build delta, or a % delta. So we actually use that for some of the smaller files, saying like, if the file is less than a certain size, maybe 10 kilobytes, it's okay that it goes 100% delta, because that means it's still only 20 kilobytes. If we have a much larger file though, like 100 kilobytes, a 100% delta is really bad, and we probably want to keep that more down to like 5%. So an absolute delta is not necessarily the nicest thing to use there. So I'm going really fast. Does anybody have questions on that? Has anyone used bundle size before on GitHub?
How are you editing these thresholds?
Good question. You set up a config. I have one somewhere over here. Oh, actually, right here. So this is the config for the application we were just looking at, actually, the deploy that we were just looking at. And you can see right here, we just set a size key. We're looking at gzip size only, and we're looking at a maximum budget size of 150,000 bytes. So yeah, you set them on the back end when you deploy the application. Probably don't need to change them all that often. It seems like
so every application has its own config file.
Yeah, every application would have its own config file, because in this case, so you can set a budget per file, or you can set a budget per group of files, or you can set an overall budget for all files. So in this case, I've only set a budget for the web client itself. You can see I did a little regex to just match things that are an app client. Robert.
So you're just looking at the resource file size.
Yep. So after they're built, we look at the final size of them. And so to do that, actually, before I get there, build tracker has 2 bits to it. There's the application that we're running, and then there's the command line interface that is doing this for you. So that actually has a separate configuration, which has a little bit more going on. We can kind of ignore that one. So essentially what it's doing is you tell it the artifacts, you tell it a glob or an array of globs of what it should look at. And so you just run the, I don't even know what the command is at this point, upload build. You just tell it build tracker CLI, go ahead and upload build, and it reads this configuration file for you, and it will spider through your application and everything that was built previously, and read all of those. It will get the stat size, the gzip size, and the Brotli size, if anybody's using Brotli yet, and upload them straight to your application instance, and you're all set, basically.
What sort of action, if like you get an exclamation point, like what do you typically do?
That was the other tab I had here. So there's a response that your CLI configuration can have. It says on comparison. So when you upload a build, if there's a parent revision that it can compare against, it will give you that same table, essentially this same table that we're looking at here. It will give you that as well as a whole bunch of other information. So you can actually get, these are real responses from the application that it returns back. So I use tacos and churros and burritos as my test name instead of food bar. But you can see, like, if it's a warning, it'll say it failed this by whatever. It can give you an error. Or if nothing is failing, it's totally fine. We just get very nice short nothing, which is really the best case that we want to see. Or you can just get that entire table as Markdown or as CSV. That's it. And what we do with it, I actually wrote it by myself on my own time for Twitter because I couldn't get the time to do it at work. We actually use it in order to prevent bad commits going through. We've actually seen it a few times where somebody's working on the service worker and all of a sudden they pull in a whole bunch of UI code into the service worker by accident because they had, there's some like transitive dependency list. All of a sudden, all this UI code comes in, and the service worker is now 300 kilobytes, which is really bad because if anybody's worked with a service worker, you want it to be as small as possible because that thing is going to get reloaded every time you deploy or any time there's a change in the service worker. So we have prevented quite a few really nasty problems from hitting our users. I have 15 seconds. Any more questions? Happy to show this anybody if they want to ask about it later. Otherwise, you can go to buildtracker.dev and get the docs and try it out yourself. 10 minutes on the dot.
All right.
Or who's up next?
Yeah.
you want to go?
I saw a list up there that showed me next, so.
Yeah,
Sure.
do it.
All right, you have to remind me how to get up on AirPlay here. Kyle, how do I get up on AirPlay here? It's been forever since I've done this.
It's not. It's not the dungeon.
I don't know. Exactly right.
So yeah, search AirPlay.
Entertainment.
Entertain room.
Okay.
Hey, the dungeon's gone.
It was gone and then it came back and now it's gone.
Let's go.
It'll be good.
Right.
There was a password on the screen.
I wrote an ESLint plugin. And I wrote it because my co-founder, James, and I, or my CEO, probably give him the respect to do, we have these periodic arguments about who's right and who's wrong about really important things. And in this particular case, if I go to our code base and I grep for strings that end with an exclamation point, you'll see we have a lot of messages that go to our user with exclamation points in the end, which is sort of James's style. He likes to be very emphatic and imperative with our users, and it drives me nuts. And we talked about this 6 months ago and didn't really come to any conclusion. And so, in true passive-aggressive programmer fashion, I decided to solve this with code. So, fortunately for us and for me, every commit that goes into our code base gets ESLinted with the fix flag. So any little quirks or whatever get patched up just as part of getting committed. So if I could write a plugin that very quietly removed these things, he would never know, except he's actually here tonight, which I was not expecting. Unfortunately, like all my secrets are shot, but hey, what the hell. So I wanted to write an ESLint plugin that would get rid of these exclamation points, or at least turn them into periods. So that's what we're doing. And how many of you folks are familiar with ESLint? Most folks, yeah. So it's a tool that lets you look at code and apply rules to it, and it'll warn you if you've got like bad syntax or weird layout, and it can fix some of those rules. It can fix up. ESLint's actually a pretty sophisticated linter in terms of the spectrum of linters that are available. And among other things, it has a plugin architecture, which is to say you can extend it. And so the way you extend it, or rather the way you configure it, is via the, let's make this a little bit bigger. You've got your ESLint RC file. I'm actually getting ahead of myself here. Or behind, take your pick.
So that's how you exit it.
Okay, here we go. So you have an ESLint configuration file, and if you, one of the things you can specify in this configuration is a list of plugins. So currently I have React, and we'll come back to this in a moment. What I actually want to do is just show you how to get a custom plugin set up. And so in our code base, I have ESLint plugins are just npm modules. And so we've got a package.json file and an index file, which is where the code for the plugin goes. And the package file is pretty straightforward. It's just a name and a version. And so when you create a plugin, it has to start with ESLint plugin. And so our plugin is going to be the 10 plugin. And this is version 1. So that's pretty much the extent of getting started. And then in the, I'm just sucking at Vim tonight. And then this is the code. And I'll explain this in a moment. But first, I want to take a step back and talk about what's going on under the covers. So how many people are familiar with abstract syntax trees, or at least have heard that? So sort of a smattering. Okay. So before we go any further on the code, I want to just briefly cover what ESLint is doing under the hood. So when you point ESLint at some code, like we have over here on the right, on the left, it is converting that basically into what is effectively a browser DOM, except instead of, for an HTML document, it's building a DOM for your source code. And the similarities are striking. Like you have a whole tree of nodes. And so actually, this is a AST Explorer website online. It's great. You just type in code, and it lets you browse the abstract syntax tree over here on the right. And so as I click around in here, what we'll see is like I can click on hello, and it'll tell me that's an identifier, and it tells me the name of the identifier. I can click on the function, and it'll tell me like, okay, this is a function expression. So it's building this tree of nodes that describe your source code. And each node has a type, and it has attributes, and it has children, just like you have in the DOM. And so when you are working in ESLint land, when you're building a plugin, you're really working in this abstract syntax tree space. You're building code that manipulates this tree or looks for specific patterns in this tree. How does that work? Well, over here in our code for our plugin, really what we're going to do is we're going to start by, I have not rehearsed this at all, so you'll have to forgive me for butchering this. We just export a rules object, and in this particular case, I'm going to have the stop shouting rule. So actually, let me just.
Sorry, this is your ESLint config file?
No, this is the this is my plugin code.
Okay.
So this is in the plugin module. I'll come back to the config
Okay,
file.
I'll stop.
Actually, I'll do that right now. So. 10 code boss. All right. So I've got this plugin started. I've got a package file. I've started to flesh out my code for it by declaring a stop shouting rule. And what I want to do is I want to enable this, because if I if I go to our code directory and I do ESLint source, I have one minor no one use var rule, not really doing anything. But if I come over here and I do something like, hey, let's just see if, hey, look, exclamation point. So if I run ESLint, we're not going to see that console log statement yet. So I've got to enable this plugin. So to that end, in my ESLint RC configuration, I have no idea where I'm doing on time here. I'm going to say 10. And that tells ESLint to load up the ESLint plugin -10 plugin that I have. And the other thing I have to do is I have to actually install that. I'm actually going to link that in this case. So I'm going to pull that plugin in. So it's now in my node modules directory, and I've got it in my configuration. So I should see when I run ESLint. Yeah. So we've got we see hi there. So we know it's pulling it in. It's not doing anything, but it's at least pulling it in. So I've now got the plugin enabled, but I also need to enable a rule. So in my list of rules down here, so here's my rules list. I like to keep things alphabetical, so I'm going to enable the tend/stop shouting rule. I'm going to say 1. You guys follow that? So just turn on rule. So if I run ESLint again, I'm getting a syntax error. So we know it's at least trying to load that up. So let's go back to our rule, and let's flesh this out a little bit. I'm gonna just sort of skim through what I'm doing here, because this file is the structure of this code of the way rules work is actually a little wonky, but it's also really interesting. So when you define a rule, you define really two things. You define a type and a create function. So the type in this particular case is suggestion. ESLint can actually have 3 different types of rules. You can have a problem, a suggestion, or layout. So problem rules are rules that will identify issues with your code that will typically break things or cause legitimate bugs. Layout tends to be like white space issues, inconsistent indentation. You may have like extra semicolons or whatnot. And then suggestions are really stylistic issues, like do you want to use single quotes or double quotes for strings, or I don't know, how do you declare numeric literals? Are you allowed to use like the exponential notation or whatever? And then suggestion rules are, wait, did I just cover that? Yeah, I'll just cover that. Okay. So in this particular case, we want to get rid of the exclamation point. So this is a suggestion rule. I'm not sure this actually has much like semantic meaning. I don't know what ES1 does with it, that if I said it was a problem versus a layout. But where the rubber really hits the road is in this create method. So what happens is ESLint parses your source code, and then it walks that DOM, that syntax tree, and calls this create function with every node that it finds in there. Why this is called create, I have no idea. Just roll with it. And it passes in a context object, which you can use to do a variety of things. In our case, we actually only do one thing with it. We report issues that we find. So in this particular case, in my function, I've just got a little check function that takes a node and does the check for the exclamation point. I'll come back to this in a moment. What I really want to get to, and what I found was the most interesting part of all this, was that this create function returns an object which maps basically rules or selectors to a function that will run when that selector is matched. So the really neat thing about ESLint is that this abstract syntax tree, you can address it with CSS-like selectors. So if you're familiar with CSS, like this will feel very intuitive. So what I'm doing here is I'm declaring effectively CSS rules. I'm declaring abstract syntax tree rules. And so like if we go back to that grep expression I did, is that here? So what we'll see is that there's certain patterns in here. So in our code base, there's a lot of show notices, there's show error, there's log.error, there's a few consistent patterns in here. And I wanted to just pick up those without replacing an exclamation point at the end of every string literal in our code base, because that would probably do evil things. And James would justifiably bring up and disable my nice plugin. So the way we do that is with this notation. So what I've got here is different node types. So I've got a bunch of call expressions. And let me go back to the syntax tree momentarily. So for example, in this particular case, this hello world is, I'm on a string literal, but if I scroll out, what we'll see is that I'm actually in a call expression state, because we're making a function call. So I want to pick up on these types of patterns where I've got call expressions. So I want to pick up a call expression where the name of the object, so call expression is like some object dot some property. So where the name of the object in this particular case is log. So this will pick up on anywhere that there's a log dot whatever. And I want to be called for all the string literals within that expression. So where there are string literals passed as arguments, call my check function. Same thing for the HTTP error object, because we've got a few of those. And then I've got a call expression with a calling name. So the name of the function is show notice or show error. And then I also have a new expression. So anywhere I create a new error, and I pass in a string literal to that new error object, I want to check that as well. So this is really how I scope what my check runs on within the context of that syntax tree. So, what's that? Oh, hang on. I have to do like the big finale. So, am I over? All right. Okay, so this stuff here calls this function here. And basically, this is pretty much what you would expect. I look for an exclamation point within the strings. If I find one, I call the context report to generate a report of this issue. And I give it a message. I give it the node that I found it in. And I give it a function to fix that up. And that function gets passed a fixer object, which I can use to modify the syntax tree. So, at the request of certain people, we will. So we'll do this, and then ESLint, so I'll just run it on the source. Fingers crossed. Okay, you can see a bunch of errors. Stop shouting everywhere. And if I and let's see, so git status. Yeah, so I've got one modification. So if I do ESLint -- fix source, I have one error, but everything has now been updated. So all of James's exclamation points are gone. I'll be committing that soon. So, all right. And James is up next, I think, because he's using my computer. All right, star.star.
You wrote an ESLint plugin under your
Are you sure?
Oh, sure.
Should be a lot faster.
Okay. Yeah, let me,
All right, we ready? Should I go? I can start with
We're moving along
preamble.
pretty quick, so.
Okay, so one thing we needed to do for our customers was provide them with the ability to remotely access robots when they're in their office, 500 miles away. And that naturally is a VPN. And so we started looking at how do we implement a VPN? And one of the natural things to look at is OpenVPN. You guys have probably seen that. It's kind of the standard open source solution. The problem with OpenVPN is that, it's 3443.
VPN.10, what's the
Yeah, that's it. Port 3443.
Oh,
And it's not HTTPS.
okay.
The problem with OpenVPN is that it's you have a VPN client and you have a VPN server. And those need to make a direct connection with one another.
Is that working?
I did lock it down pretty good. Maybe too well.
.ai?
Yeah. Maybe it's 4334.
Just know it's a palindrome.
So the issue that we have with OpenVPN was that you kind of need a direct connection between the client and the server. And our software, like many others, all right, that's all right. We don't need to okay, good. Our software, thanks, like many others, goes through the cloud, right? So we can't create a direct connection between someone's laptop in their office and our device that's sitting in a factory behind a firewall. So we needed a solution that would really create kind of this centralized kind of gateway that would route traffic between the person's office and the factory. And so the solution that we ended up using is called Zero Tier. This is a really cool open source VPN. And the way that it works is these guys already have controllers all over the world. And you can use them for free, and they basically just help direct traffic. And you can download their software and install it on your own to create your own version of one of their controllers. It's called Zero Tier 1. And this is something you do with apt-get install Zero Tier 1. So we've installed this on our edge devices that's running Node, and then we've also set up VPN.10 in the cloud that's running on DigitalOcean. It's just a CentOS box. And that box acts as a kind of rendezvous point so that when the customer sets up the VPN client, they connect up through our rendezvous server, our controller, which then connects them back down to our cellmate. So I'll give you to keep this kind of short, I'll give you a demo of how it works without getting into too much of the code, and then I'll show you a little bit of how the code works. So I'm going to disable this first. So I've disabled it. Naturally, we want to make it easy for a customer to disable and enable VPN functionality. And so what they do is they go in, they say, yeah, I want to have VPN. So one of our benefits is that this is way easier to do than any other VPN solution that you can buy off the shelf from some of our competitors. So you save that, and what that does is it sends a message to our device saying, okay, you need to set up a network. Our Amazon server communicates with our VPN controller and says, create a network. So that's something only our Amazon server can do, or our Heroku server. And then it sends a request down to the cellmate. It says, join the network, and then it authorizes it to join, and that's what it's doing now. So there's obviously pretty strict controls on who can join this network, because anyone who joins it now has access to the customer's factory, which could be a big problem. So once the cellmate has joined the network, then what it does is it's creating a virtual network to bridge the network that's on the device with 10.10.10 route. And what that does is that when you install the zero-tier client, do you have it installed here by chance? Okay. When you install the zero-tier client on your Mac or your Windows box, it creates a virtual adapter. And it assigns one of these 10.10.10 addresses to that adapter. And once you're connected to the network, which is just literally saying join, and you put in that code, it joins and it's done. And so then, now you've got the ability to ping any device that's on the other side of the device that's sitting behind the customer's firewall in their factory. Assuming that you authorize the client. So when someone tries to join the network, it'll contact our controller. It says, hey, someone's trying to join this network. They don't get an IP address yet until someone refreshes this. They click to authorize that device, and then it assigns them an IP, and then they can route traffic between them. And just quickly, you logged into GitHub? Let's see. Okay, I'll just show you quickly what this looks like in our code base. That's not it. We actually run a separate Docker container with our zero-tier configuration.
And just to, what James did in that, to give you guys some idea of why this is important, a lot of our customers in these automation cells are running other devices like PLC controllers that have the ability to connect to them and do diagnostics directly on that. Some of these controllers have human-machine interfaces that run VNC, so you can screen share onto those as well. So there's a lot of other devices that are on the other side of these edge devices, our edge device, that our customers don't normally have access to, and so providing this adds a lot of value for them.
And when you look at what we're doing in the code, this is actually a little bit kind of a cheat, right? We're just using Zoom. Oh,
Plus.
so Node has you can spawn a child process, and exec_sync is just a version of that. So we're just essentially issuing command line commands that tell it what to do with zero-tier when we want to, add a. If we want to check the status of the VPN, if we want to send the IP address that we want to route between, if we want to join the network, etc. Oh yeah, look at that. Exclamation point.
I like that you knew it was there.
Yeah.
That's so sweet.
So yeah, we're basically just issuing these commands just at the command line, and I haven't created kind of a JavaScript version of zero-tier. We're just using JavaScript to interact with it, the command line, and parsing the output. So it's a little not ideal, but it works pretty well. There's a lot more to it, but I'll stop there. Does anybody have any question about VPNs? Sure.
I was gonna say, are you guys targeting one type of operating system, or are you going for Unix and Windows, or?
Their client can be installed on Linux, Windows, and Mac. So if you go to zero-tier,
That's the other thing I was wondering is if it was just doing commands through that client of theirs.
well, so there's the client that you download, so if you go here and download it, they've got Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, Linux. They got a lot of shit. But that doesn't matter to us. Client is relevant, other than troubleshooting if the customer runs into a problem, which that I think is in our future. We're probably going to have a challenge with that. People calling up and saying it's not working. I've already run into an issue where their firewall was preventing UDP traffic, and it's like, so that took a while to figure out. There's always that stuff. Whenever you get into networking, you're going to have that. So, anyway, it was a fun project. Seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, it looks super clean.
Yeah.
That's nice.
All right.
Kendall?
Yeah.
You ready?
Just make sure all my stuff is ready.
Yeah, kind of. I was gonna do in between these though, the thing that, the hiring thing, which is cool because it's worked out good in the past, at least a little bit. So let's do a raise of hands thing. Everybody looks around who works somewhere who is hiring people. There's like, good, right? So let's just leave them up for a minute. If you're looking for a job, look at all those hands. There's all kinds of people that are like hiring people, and then maybe we'll do the other side. Are you look? Is anybody actively looking?
Oh yeah.
It's the seller's market.
So I don't feel like we need to do much more, but I don't know. Hopefully you saw each other. Keep seeing each other.
Maybe hang around afterwards and you two just, since there's two of you right now, just mingle,
You know a little bit.
Also, on that note, with a group of 200 plus engineers, we're finally about to have the website a little bit more done. And on the site, and we're also actually going to start doing a newsletter, a once a month newsletter. Anyone who came to the social night, we were collecting emails. Hit me up on Slack. Send me your email because we're going to be starting sending out a newsletter, and I'll post a message on there. But on the newsletter, we're also going to do jobs and on the website as well. So if you want to post something, obviously there's a jobs channel on Slack, but we can also do it on the website and in the newsletter. Post a job opening if you're looking for people, and that would be a good resource for you guys to actually, for people looking for work to find open positions. So more information when that's about to come out, should be coming out shortly, but keep that in mind and let me know if you guys want to post a job. You can give me the details and I'll put them up there.
Sweet. I'm on the nice 9, so I would deal with you. I'm Kendall. I haven't got a chance to meet really any of you, but I work at Forestry, and if you don't know what Forestry is, we make a get back headless CMS, which is a mouthful on its own. I'm not going to get into that today. I'm actually not going to talk about that product at all today. I'm going to talk about an open source project that we've been hacking on the past few months that we're super excited about. We're about to announce it at the Jamstack conference next month. So this is still technically private, and you're the first people outside of the company that will see this, which is exciting. So keep it, I guess, hush-hush until next month, but otherwise, I'm excited to dive in. I don't like you. Yeah, and well, obviously I'm here, so. Yeah.
6 people watching.
Yeah, it's okay. So before I dive into the project, I just want to give a little bit of context as to why we decided to make what we did and what problems we think that we're solving. So let's just shift to the world of CMSs for a second. It's a very exciting one, as developers love this world. Over the past 10 plus years, there's been a lot of shifts for the developer experience with CMSs. We've gone from the monoliths, and everyone knows what I mean when I say that, to the other end of the extreme, the headless, and I don't really need to explain why that's been a better shift, because we all know why. There's a lot more flexible, we can essentially use the tools we love, etc. But for the end users, the content editors, despite these big technical shifts, there hasn't been a lot of changes. They're still met with a list of abstracted fields from which they have to hold a context in their head of how those fields and what they input into it actually gets translated and rendered onto their site. So while it's entirely functional, it's not exactly an ideal interface for which those users should be editing content. Site builders understand this problem, and they're making efforts to mitigate it. But developers hate them for good reason. They're black boxes, and they're just terrible to work with in general. So we wanted to make something that would hopefully marry these two things, a great user experience, kind of like what the site builders are doing, but also have a great developer experience where we can use the tools that we want. So we made Tina. The logo is a llama. So, and it's essentially, it's a CMS, but it's a new kind of CMS, and I'm going to demo it today so you're going to see why. What's different about it is it's a site editing toolkit rather than a content management system that you put into your code base, and it's hopefully applicable for any modern JavaScript workflow. So we'll see a little bit more about what that means as I'm demoing. Oh, I can't even access. There we go. Hello. So this is a blog that I made. It's just a Gatsby starter. Super simple. And we're going to put Tina on it. I'm like mega zoomed in because I was practicing this on my display. And so yeah, the goal is today is we're going to put Tina on this, we're going to edit some content, we're going to see how it works. But it's going to be super simple and fast, and I'm only 2 minutes in, so. So the first thing that I would do to add Tina to this site would just be to install some plugins. I've already done that to save time. So I'm in a Gatsby config here, and if anybody knows Gatsby, every time you install something, you have to come to this file and add it. So I'm just going to add that quick. Those are the 2 packages we need to run Tina. Restart the dev server, because that's how Gatsby works. And then wait for Gatsby to be fast in every way that matters. Then I'm just going to restart this, and we can see just a little bit of change. The site looks the same, but in the lower left-hand corner, you can see this edit icon that's happened. I'm just going to open this up. And this sidebar that just extended, this is kind of the home base for Tina, right? All of our editing and any content, the user interface will live in this sidebar. Right now, Tina's saying, hey, you haven't registered any forms with me. I don't know what content I can edit, so let's do a little bit more work to get it to work. But I just want to take a moment to say how cool it is that just by adding, a plugin, we already have something going on. And you can see by where I'm going with this is that we're going to be adding the CMS into our components itself. So it's not just a separate platform we're going to go register, right? We're going to go, now I'm going to go edit this blog template file, which outputs this sort of awesome looking blog post. Actually, I want to edit this one because I like the photo better. More colorful. So I'm going to go to this blog template file. And this blog is generated by Markdown. So it's just a Markdown template. It's using Gatsby's Markdown Remark plugin to use that data and put it where it needs to go. So given that we're dealing with that data type, I'm going to import a specific thing from Tina that deals with Markdown called remark form. I'm just going to import that. I'm going to add a few things to my GraphQL query that Tina needs. I copied this all because I didn't want to have to live code. And then, or this is going to break because it's all. And then I'm just going to add this remark form, wrap my blog template component with the remark form. And we're going to restart the dev server and see what happens. And the remark form is just a higher order component that Tina will take that blog template and then return us something that we can actually sort of have that content editing layer to be able to gain access to the data. So open up the sidebar and you see that we have a lot more fields now to work with. Yeah, that's very cool. So we see that live updating, we get that kind of instant feedback, which is super awesome. And I also just want to reiterate, all I did was import a high order component, wrap my template in it, add a few things to my GraphQL query, and Tina went and found all that stuff. Markdown's pretty simple to find that, right? We got from, matter, and body. There's not really much else going on with that. Tina can handle other types of data, but this is just super simple 2 steps. But obviously this sidebar kind of looks terrible. It's you don't want to have your users looking at like date objects and these paths. So I'm going to move us forward ahead in time where I've done a little bit more work to see what a more complex setup would look like. It's really not that complex, but I'll just show you. So here we are. We're in the future. And I've, done a little bit more work to make this sidebar pretty. And as I'm playing with this, see if I want you to just check out the markdown file, just kind of keep an eye on what's happening here. But I'm going to refresh just for good measure because I want this to work. I'm going to update an image. Let's pick, what's a good one? I like plants, so we'll do that. Maybe the designers are really into clay, so we'll do that. If you're watching the markdown file, you'll see that those files are happening in real time. So yeah, Tina is writing the disk right now. And the Gatsby development server is picking up those changes, and that's how we're able to sort of see these live updates happening. And it's just happening right in my local file system. So, cool, I made some awesome changes. I want to save my work now, and this is a feature we literally just added, so we're not going to get any feedback right now from the UI, but if you see down here, it's asking for my password, so I'm going to input it. Then if I did it right, then this will work. And so Tina just committed those changes that I just made to my markdown file. It's titled Tina commit. You can customize it so you can actually input your commit message. But this is just a super simple, quick setup that I did. This is obviously a really contained example of what's going on. And I only edited content that was already on the page, but I don't want to mislead you. Tina has the power to fully replace a CMS, right? Like you could actually create content and use it in your workflows. That said, we're certainly in alpha. When we release next month, we'll be in beta. And so we have a lot of development to do. We have a lot of work to do, but we're really excited about this future where developers don't have to leave their code base to actually make a CMS or make their sites editable. And then also users will get a better sort of one-to-one feedback about as they're editing content, seeing it update in context. So we need beta testers, and I'd also love feedback if we have Gatsby sites, Next sites. Tina's made with React, so right now it works with any React framework mostly. We want to make it work with Vue. We want to make it a JavaScript agnostic tool. So if you're using JavaScript, you should be able to use it. But right now it's pretty keyed into React. So please hit me up in Slack if you're interested, if you want to learn more about how it works, or if you want to test it, if you want to put it on your site and break it, and then in 3 weeks the code base will be live, and so I'll post it in Slack and you can kind of see how it works. So thank you.
Hey Kendall, does it only? How do you make sure it only runs in development?
So. Yeah.
So someone,
you're saying
like a live blog, someone can't go and edit.
Yeah, you're saying like what would we do in production?
Yeah.
So yeah, we're obviously we've considered that. We're thinking we're going to make a backend solution that will essentially run a dev server in the cloud, so that folks could go to like /admin of their site, which would expose this development experience. But then it'll be completely separate from the production environment. And then when they hit save, you could commit and talk to Git, or it could go post to wherever you want that data to go, essentially.
Okay.
But
yeah, because I know a lot of content creators don't want to have an environment set up.
No, right. That's why right now only developers can use this tool, because you have to run a local environment. You kind of have to know how to set it up. That's not where we want to go with it. And so in order to make it exposed to content teams, that's going to be when we actually release it as like a product. And while this tool, this like interface will stay open source forever, the backend solution would probably be something that Forrester would provide. So
very cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
Kyle, you up?
Close your eyes.
An investigation. In case you can't get straight.
Okay. Am I good? Okay, so this is just like a really like 10,000 footish overview of WebRTC. Have you guys ever dealt with WebRTC at all? Perfect. You won't be able to correct me. All right, so WebRTC it enables you to do communication from browser to browser. So instead of like hitting a server for a file or video stream, you can ask another browser for it. It has some really nice JavaScript APIs, so capturing audio and video. RTC peer connection is really dedicated for audio and video directly from browser to browser, and RTC data channel is for streaming data such as files or where players' positions are if you're doing like multiplayer games online, or you can share your favorite memes. And so a lot of people have this misconception that like you need or you don't need a server to do RTC connection, and that's fake news. You actually do. I have never implemented one, but the networking guys at my work give me some tips. So there's two different types of servers that you need for WebRTC. One is called a stun, and one is called a turn server. A stun server is basically like you as the browser asking like, okay, where am I? Am I behind the firewall? Am I on the open internet? Where am I on the NAT? A turn then is what you make your connection with the other browser with. So it essentially acts as a relay server between you and the other browser to get their connection. And yeah, the disclaimer down here is it's built to cope with real-world networking. Client applications need to traverse NAT gateways, firewalls, peer-to-peer networking needs to fall back onto a turn server, if something goes wrong. So this is kind of how it works. One MacBook Pro makes a request to a regular server and it returns all your standard files. And then after that, the MacBook Pro goes, this is who I am, this is where I am. And then the server responds with a WebSocket connection. And so once you have that WebSocket connection, if another server decides to join that, if another computer decides to join the network, it's like, this is who I am, this is where I am, and where is everybody else? And the server replies with where the available candidates are. These are called ICE candidates. And ICE stands for Interactive Connectivity Establishment, with a three-letter acronym you guys can memorize. So once that connection comes back, you can then establish it with your other browser. You can share things like video, audio, really everything. So this is what the client-side code kind of looks like. You're establishing a new RTC peer connection with a server that's just a standard JS object. You can handle that connection. So this is when that ICE candidate is returned from the server, so you can handle that connection in this kind of way. If it exists, I want to establish that connection from another peer, and if it doesn't, we'll just get on with your life. Let's see, and then I'll show you some beautiful demo. Should have asked Chris for some CSS tips. So, let's see. Okay, so this is, as soon as I click this start button, it's going to ask me for my permissions. So do you want to allow me to use the camera? Say yes. Then I'm going to make a call, and I hope this works. Okay. So after the call has been established, before the call is established, you make a new RTC peer connection. And then once that's established, you can handle that connection. And handling the connection is literally the exact same thing I showed. So if there's another peer, add it as an ICE candidate, and then make the connection. And in Chrome, you can do this cool thing, which is you can inspect the connections that you're making. So I can see the inbound and outbound. So if I do outbound, I can see all the packets that I've sent,
the bytes that I'm sending per second, the encoding and decoding, and then the inbound. This video stream. So you can see like where it's coming from, how it happened. This is all the history of the connection. So I created an offer for a connection. You make a negotiation, which is like, okay, what kind of data do you want to send me, and am I okay with that? And then down here you're adding the ICE candidate, so this is that actual connection to the other browser. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Any questions or?
Have you built anything with this?
That's, yeah, so the, my company Collective does, so for large corporations, if they want to do huge, how do I describe them? Huge conference calls with 60,000 people, it would be a real bottleneck on their network if they had everybody download it from a server. So they'll just share the video from browser to browser as opposed to everybody downloading this live stream all at once. Yeah.
Relax on.
What's that?
Is there any noticeable difference in lag?
I think from broadcast to it hitting an end user's browser, the average time is around 12 seconds, which is pretty good. Yeah, WebRTC. You can also do files, so like Windows, 7 is end of lifing at the end of next year, and so people are going to have to upgrade to Windows 10. And if you're in an IT department and you want to ship Windows 10 to all of your devices, well, across 60,000 computers, right? Like, it could either take a really long time, or you could shorten it by using something like WebRTC. So, yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Are there like JavaScript solutions for the
Stun and turn servers?
Stun and turn
Yeah. So
servers?
there's Socket.io is a pretty popular one. This is mainly used for WebSockets, but also allows you to do. The most popular one is Go. And that's what we use.
Is it like Go the language?
Yeah, sorry, it's written in Go. Yeah, it's not called Go. But this is a node implementation.
There's this package called GunDB that combines a CRDT database with WebRTC to do this stuff. It's a JavaScript easier to use solution than just straight WebRTC.
Yeah, so they have really good documentation for this. And then on the client side, there's Adapter.js, which is basically like making your client-side code browser agnostic, because they all have their different little quirks with establishing connections and the naming of their objects and stuff like that. So that's what we use for both of those. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I saw one for forced quarantine. That's what everybody's doing.
Yeah, it's the unfortunate part. But yeah. Oh, there's one really cool startup, which I thought was a really clever idea. It was a CDN over WebRTC. So it's basically like, on my local network, who has this file, and do I have to go fetch it from a remote server? And Google bought them. So I thought that was pretty awesome. I thought it was a really clever idea. It was like some kids that were like freshmen in college. It was really great.
Is this like a standard browser feature, or was it something that was built on top of existing features?
Yeah, this is, so it's standard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so there's like RDC peer connections. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Anybody? Concerns?
It's still all my bandwidth over there.
Yeah, that's the point, is to save money on band. That's the point. Cool. Okay, thanks guys for listening. Quick programming note, I forgot to check the live chat that we have going. Steve Bishop, I believe that's who posted this, he said posted on something in Slack.
I think earlier, but they're hiring teachers at Galvanize. And I think remote, and I don't know if they have any on-premise, but if anyone wants to be a teacher of a boot camp, they're hiring there too. All right, next, Chris.
Yeah, I'm ready, but I put on the schedule to like, feel free to stretch your legs. Why don't we take 5? I'll start in 4 minutes.
Yeah. This is actually the live stream. And this is the real live. It hasn't been this is open broadcasting software. You can do like different things like a full screen, so see behind me and then I have like a code and the green screen and then me in the box. So this is just a code. You run it through here, you put your remote in, and this is the YouTube. This is the stream settings for YouTube. I run them through OBS.
Actually, I've never worked with Gatsby in particular, but I work with CMSs all day, every day.
Oh, cool. Which ones are you working with?
So we have our own amplifier.
Oh, you made your own then?
Yeah, we built it.
Oh, damn.
It's on a Google server, essentially. We just switched over from Google to Google, which actually has its limitations, but that was really cool. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, yeah, I'd be stoked to just like get feedback and just like crowd test it. And...
Yeah. You don't do very well with the actual.
What do you do at G5?
I am a technical customer care specialist.
Oh, cool.
So,
yeah, I do support at Fortune.
Oh, okay. So
yeah.
You know the.
I know the world.
I was on the Let's Rock help desk before this job.
Nice.
Support IT stuff.
Totally.
Going more towards engineering stuff like so. I'm trying to do more of they want me to be a content manager / engineer, something on G5 really great at their jobs.
Totally.
So I'm trying to figure out solutions, and that looks like
that would be a really good solution.
Yeah.
What's like
just because of the finance side. Right now, like you're saying, go into CMS and people don't know what they don't know
and for us, or for like more technical folks, it's just like we're just so used to that.
Yeah, like aggregation and any of that. So to be able to actually just be like,
right.
That's like the console.
I know. Yeah, it could be so much better.
Yeah. So I would love to be able to test it. So,
yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. I'll reach out to you.
Awesome. Thank you.
DSonofCray@gmail.
Yeah, Donovan Cray.
That's easy.
Yep.
Easy to remember. Sweet.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh.
No, just I did create React apps since it was already too much. I don't even know ES could fix anything.
Yeah, right?
On everything and added a couple things. Presentation. This is right now because we're working on they changed the API.
I saw that when I was looking at it.
They changed the API for you to and so like you gotta like try to be a consumer and having us response to it. So like job listings, be able to post job listings and there's a lot of job listings page, so being able to add content super quick. Posting a job, getting
You're out there now. I got you just going.
Individual community posts. So essentially, what I want to be able to happen is, hey, you want to be listed on the site, have like a little profile template, and then template page, and then you can hit me up with like the information you want to put on there, and then if I get that's what I'm doing, then I'm going to be able to easily go in, create a new page, same template, just a new page, so when you're creating
what the best way to kind of on it, I kind of forget how to look really good. I mean, it's just it's BendJS.Slack. You have to be invited
click that button and you're not. Just a custom slug that fits this template page.
Alright, you want to do this?
No, yeah, let me know this. I would love to run through it with you and then get that.
How powerful you are? Apparently this thing's working out pretty good.
It is, yeah. We had up to 6 people watching. After our little breaks, a few people were watching.
Good job, 6 people.
Well, hopefully we can like we keep doing this and it actually like works every time.
I love our little owl device. I want to make little ears on it. All right. I might take a little longer than 10 minutes. 15 tops, though. I have some points to make about front-end development and how it's changed over time, I think. Or some stuff has and some stuff hasn't. I feel like it's just kind of a cool thing to think about. So if we're going to define it a little bit, it's a job and a title, and that's fairly obvious. I don't think anybody's confused about what a front-end developer is in this room, but I think it matters to people in an interesting way because it's kind of what you're paid to do. So like when shit changes, you kind of want to know, you know? Am I still like valuable and stuff? Anyway, a front-end developer deals with, you know, very abstractly, you're like a browser nerd. Like that's what the front part of front-end development is, which is kind of a big deal. And because you're a browser nerd, that means that you need to deal with not only the browsers and the landscape of browsers, but the landscape of devices that those browsers run in and all the human beings that use those things. We're just talking abstractly. And so what does it mean? What do you need to use? Well, because you're a browser person, the browser only speaks a couple of languages. Actually, it's kind of a lot. But the big ones are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So like, it's going to come up at work. You know, like that's the stuff that you need to know for sure. As tools change, those change too, but slower and not as much. And there's not really like languages fighting to like. There's not an alternative to CSS for styling stuff. It's not happening. at least not today or this decade anyway. But I feel like that's kind of the important part of this, is what got me thinking about what kind of points I'm trying to make, is that people get paid to do this job. On all these job boards, it says front-end developer, hiring senior front-end developer, full-stack developer, but it's just used a lot. So people care, because when things change, it's like, it changes the way that you make money in the world, and I feel like that's significant in a way. So yeah, you're a browser person, there's a million freaking browsers in the world, you live in there, you live in DevTools, that's the job of a front-end developer. Just that crap is crazy. Like, just that part of our job is like a full job. You know, it depends on how serious you are about making things work nicely and perfectly across browsers. And of course, those are the languages. Even this part is interesting in it. I've known lots of front-end developers over the years who are extremely proficient at like just HTML and CSS, don't write a lot of JavaScript, and still today are gainfully employed as a front-end developer. So it's like they're out there, there's a lot of them, and then there's, you know, lately a hell of a lot more front-end developers that are just really purely JavaScript focused and maybe don't even write a lot of CSS at all. So it's funny to think of just those three languages, just the core languages of browsers, and be like, and have there be so much division between them. So I wrote an essay earlier this year called The Great Divide that goes into that, but that's not what this talk is about, but it's, if you kind of feel that weirdness in the world of front-end development, it might be worth a read for you. I'm going to turn this up a bunch. Brad kind of put a point on one of the divisions of the weirdness of front-end development. Hopefully you can hear this okay. Ooh, no sound at all. Oh, it's supposed to be going to those speakers. Oh, we lost the remote for the TV. I'm Brad Frost. He makes a point about, he coins the term the front of the front and the back of the front, which is kind of hilarious, but it's just kind of like, Brad is a very front of the front kind of guy, like a more of on the design side, more on the HTML and CSS side, and he sees so much of this back end stuff creeping into the front end, and he's not like, he sees that as weird, but also sees it as an opportunity to like work side by side with people like that, and if we can work right next to each other and different people focus on the same stuff, it works out pretty great, right? Cool. So I want to make this point about like how back-end stuff, it seems to me, has kind of creeped over into the front end in a way. Not for all sites in the world, but as a trend, especially the last, say, 4 years, has been a big deal. One of the biggest things I see is this idea of component-driven design. There's all these JavaScript frameworks. I bet this whole room works in these frameworks. They've absolutely taken over the world of front-end development. You can't possibly ignore them, and they disagree on all kinds of stuff. How they, how components work and whether they should be compiled ahead of time or not. They fight all the time about what the proper way to do things is, but kind of under the big handshake of all of them is that you build things in components. Like that was just all of them, even native web components. Components is right in the name. You build things in components. It's just the way it is. And it's turned out that the way we build things in the front end is kind of because of that. Like I want to write semantic HTML. I'm not shitting on that. I want to write good CSS. I like working in JavaScript, but I want to like chunk it together in ways that make sense to me and then build my app out from those components. It just turns out that's a nice way to work, that it's just kind of shaken out over time. And those my things are like, there's templating in there, and like there's like a chunking of responsibilities for each component and isolating of design to those components and how those components handle data. Like if we can smash all those together, it kind of feels good, at least in a lot of architectures, and then websites kind of become this. Instead of just like, it's a bunch of divs and h1s and crap, it's architected from my own ideas of how components should be chunked together. That's like in any framework, and websites end up kind of being like that. So let's look at it through the guise of CodePen, an app I work on. Like if you're looking at this kind of thing, what's a component on this page? We'll zoom way in, and even way more in than that. Even that little heart guy right there, that's a component. And it's like, it's just a little piece of SVG, like it's just sitting in the markup on the page, I can do that, but we've made it into a component of our own just for a little developer experience, because it's kind of nice to say, that's just a heart component. And what happens behind the scene is that all SVG best practices come along for the ride, accessibility best practices come along for the ride, it's sized appropriately, a bunch of just nice stuff just happens because we've decided a nice like responsibility chunk for that component belongs there. So what else is a component? You don't have to zoom out very far to find another like appropriate component. Like that icon next to a number is a meta item component, and it's like, gosh, are you over componentizing? I don't think so, because in this case, there's a little tiny piece of CSS that applies to it because it's got its own tiny little grid layout. But more importantly, it has data now. It has to know about that number, and it probably has a click handler on it, because if you click it, some data's going to change, and it needs to go back to the sky or whatever. So there's a different chunk of responsibilities that happen with that component, and it's just nice to build in that way. We can keep zooming out and be like, that string of numbers makes sense as a component to us, and there's a header and a preview that kind of makes sense with their own responsibilities. The whole thing turns out as an item component for us, kind of a card component, no surprise there. It's a nice way to build stuff. Then there's a grid of items, which has a different level of responsibility. It has its own grid layout, and notably a grid has pagination, so there's some responsibility there. And these aren't just our own concepts. They're just like, we decided these are the right components for us architecturally, and we want to build our site out of them because it makes sense to us. Kind of cool. So this whole idea of components, which is just an abstract idea that works across all the frameworks, front-end devs have just decided that's the way that websites should be built. It's kind of shaping out in that way. Designers are like, way to catch up, yo, I already work like that. And other developers are like, cool, sounds like a good idea, good luck. Components is just the way of how things run. So let's think about, even zooming out further than that. If we look at, let's just get into it. We left off with this item grid component. What else? There's a title component, maybe some buttons, maybe a tabs component. We keep zooming out, and it's kind of like the whole page ends up being pieced together from components. This is how things work in this world a bit. And by that time, the whole damn page is a component, and when the whole damn page is a component, really the URL is a component. So all of a sudden, it's like front-end developers are deciding and chunking responsibility together all the way to the top, which is a URL, and now you've become the damn site architect. So dealing with URLs has all of a sudden become, instead of back-end developer, give me a URL and I will build a front end at this URL. No, I'll get my own URL. Thank you very much. It's just kind of like site architecture as a whole, from the tiniest thing to the biggest things, has kind of moved to be a front-end developer concern. So that it's just added to the haystack of things that we need. We talked about data just a little bit. This is kind of an interesting thing. Like we talked about, there's a whole grid of crap. And you can imagine, obviously, a lot of that data is coming from a database. Some API call gets made, gives us a bunch of data, and we sprinkle it out to our components, and it works, right? That's a query component in this case, because we're making a database query. But a query component in our case, because we're using this technology called GraphQL and Apollo, it ends up kind of looking like this. We write this query, which to me looks like you went up to a whiteboard and just brainstormed what idea you would need, data you would need to build this page, and then put some curly brackets around some crap. That's kind of what it looks like. But GraphQL is just a syntax that says, I want this data, and then magic happens and that data arrives. It's a nice syntax, but what's more significant to me is there's kind of a handing off of, instead of a back-end developer giving you this data, it's a front-end developer doing this work. Like when I build a component, I write that code. I'm not a freaking back-end developer, but all of a sudden I'm responsible for my own data now. So that's more significant to me. I like the technology of GraphQL, but it's more significant to me that who's asking for that data has shifted jobs in a way. And it's not just the asking for the data, that's pretty more obvious, but certainly changing the data, mutating the data, sending it back to the server, that almost feels like that's definitely a back-end developer's job. Like that's a part of GraphQL too. Instead of a query, it's called a mutation. In this case, if you click on that number 229, it changes to 230, so there's got to be a little logic there, and then it sends it back. And then really the mutation code isn't terribly different than what a query looks like. It's like, here's the data that's changed, I'm giving it back to you, please do what you need to do to make that happen at the database level. So that's kind of amazing too. That's definitely a thing that I wasn't a part of before. I'd be like, please, backend developer, do that part for me. I don't do that stuff, and now that has become my responsibility too. Now here's a kind of an interesting concept that we talked about, the GraphQL parts of it and the queries. This just happens to be React Webpack kind of setup, but Vue has notably a single file components, and Angular has folders full of components too. So this kind of is shaking out across the world of front-end development, but you have these components, remember they're chunks of responsibility, end up as kind of like folders in your project that are like, Here's an index file, so it's easy to import, that does boilerplate stuff. The name component is the template, has all that nice HTML in it. The queries are separated, so it's like, here's the data that's all chunked together. And then notably, we're like, hey, let's do the design there too. That is kind of happening across front-end development. Let's have any styles that are associated with this responsibility chunk be there too. You don't have to work in that way, but it's kind of cool. What's worked for us is just simple, what's called CSS modules, which is a CSS file that just applies to just this module that we apply to it. And we use class names like root, which is the div container of that component at all. Root's a terrible class name. You'd never write that in CSS, but it doesn't matter in this case. It's just a naming convention that says you're applying to the root level of that component. By the time it ends up in the DOM, it's all obfuscated anyway, so it doesn't matter, which is kind of nice. It gives some strength to our developer, our designers who are just like, I'm happy to jump in here and make changes because I can't screw it up in a way, or I can't knock a bar stool over in another bar, as they joke about in CSS. You know, like I can't make a change that actually, you know, spiders its way across the site because all the styles are scoped. So we talked about component-driven design, site-level architecture, becoming these architects of the whole site and dealing with URLs, getting data and changing data and dealing with APIs. We didn't even get into state management much, but that's all on the shoulders of JavaScript-oriented architectures. That's a lot of crap. That's like a full-time job right there, and that's just the new stuff. That's just the stuff that seems to me has arrived at front-end developers' doorsteps that doesn't include just knowing enough HTML and CSS to pull off the design you're handed at all. Just that's a job. Like, how am I going to do that? What is that drop shadow? How can I use a pseudo element over here? All that stuff that you already need to know to be a front-end developer is still there. Thinking systemically about your design, all of accessibility is on the shoulders of front-end developers. 80% of performance of websites, they say, is on the shoulders of front-end developers. All that cross-browser testing stuff, all this stuff, you know, really caring about the users who use your website, all that stuff is already at our doorstep as front-end developers, and all the new stuff. So it seems to me like our job isn't shrinking, it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But you're still just a browser person, you know? That job that you were hired to do is the same. You know, your job title is still the same, it's just new stuff has arrived. The haystack of crap grows and grows and grows. So another way to look at it is like a spectrum of technology, you know? Like here's back-endy stuff and front-endy stuff. The way that we talk about websites changes too. You might say, we talk about a LAMP stack website. That's the tech stack I'm going to use to spin it up. Well, if I'm a front-end developer, the things that we're talking about, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, have nothing to do with that. The way that we talk about a LAMP stack, I'm over here, and the way the website is talked about is over there. There's like a divide, and it's changed over time. You know, mean stack became cool, and it moved over a little bit. We don't talk about the OS anymore. Who cares about the OS? My God, Linux something, obviously. But it's moved way to the right as well, because we're talking about actual framework that builds the thing. So the way that we talk about that website, front-end developers are starting to overlap with more and more. Then we move into some kind of serverless architecture, which moves to the right even more. When we're talking about serverless, we've totally stopped talking about even the servers themselves. And as a front-end developer, because I can write in JavaScript, I might be involved in writing some of that code anyway, and it's really well React website. It's not that, you know, obviously that's maybe a LAMP stack is even underneath that. You know, this stuff gets complicated, but it's interesting in the way that we talk about websites. Now, the way he's talking about this website is all front-end. Like, as a front-end developer, I'm all over that. The way that we talk about the way the website is built has become more about talking about the front end than talking about the back end in a way. So on that spectrum, if we're thinking about what, you know, this modern world that's starting to happen, I don't care about operating systems. I don't even care about servers. Let's just wipe those away. It's not that databases aren't important. They're more important than they ever were, but I don't like deal with them and manage them in the same way. And it's probably me just talking to some headless CMS or some fancy ass llama thing, you know? Like I don't even know. Like I'm just dealing with an API and incorporating it in different ways. So the stack ends up more like this, and it's like those server-side languages more and more happen in Node, which it might be my wheelhouse anyway, because I'm a JavaScript dev and come to JavaScript meetups. All this stuff is like core JavaScript developer stuff, dealing with APIs and frameworks and all that. And of course, CSS and HTML always has been front-end developer stuff. So these like spectrum, like we have it all. We're starting to feel like kind of extra powerful. And if you think about all that stuff, and then you just sprinkle on the pudding, you know, you're like, I know Git stuff really well, I can write tests, I can incorporate design, I know about build processes and performance and accessibility and deployment and all these things that you got to know about to do our job. So you have the whole spec and you know all the sprinklings on top. It's like no freaking wonder people feel super powerful these days, and they're starting more not even think of themselves as front-end developers, but as full-stack developers. It's like a cause of celebration almost. Now it feels like a lot also. Like that's cool. I've even met people that like introduce themselves that way, you know, like Bob Vance or whatever. Like, Chris Gordon, a full stack developer. That's a huge haystack of responsibilities. If that made you sweat, made me sweat a little bit. That it seems like you're not going to know it all equally well. Even if you want to, you're going to not know all that stuff equally well. You're going to end up being better at there's peaks and valleys to your knowledge, and hopefully you work at a cool job where they like. There's other people with different peaks and valleys that you work with to kind of do that stuff, which is cool. This is what happens though. If you're all alone, maybe your valleys are front end stuff, but you're good at back end stuff. You know, you end up a little uneven, and it's problematic. Like, you know, like sure you're full stack. But just because you install Bootstrap doesn't make you full stack necessarily. Then there's me. I'm literally the exact opposite of that. I like feel super good at front end stuff, but then I can write a little back end stuff. But you kind of don't want me back there, you know. But I still feel powerful these days because like this stuff is new to me. Like this is me writing a cloud function. But this is like where I hope we get. Yeah, togetherness. Cool. So, but what unites us, what hasn't changed, even though shit changes all the time, is that we still care about browsers and we still care about the landscape of browsers and all the people that use it and the performance and accessibility. We've had to care about that stuff forever, and we still do. So that's it. So that's the end of my. That's a little over, sorry.
That's all right.
I had to condense it to talk.
Well, just FYI, if anyone has an 8 o'clock hard stop, we're approaching that, but we only have 2 talks left. I got Jason and then David. And they both should be super interesting, so hopefully you can stick around for just a little bit.
Possibly follow that. So screwed. It's entertainment, man. So, hi. I'm Jason Weiner. I've signed up for a bunch of these. I've been in Bend for about 2 years, moved up here from the Bay Area. I've made the a number of times. I have a number of jobs open for React Native developers, for Node developers, for JavaScript developers as well. So hit me up if you know of anybody who's looking for work in town. It's in town, so I don't want remote people. I want people here because I kind of want to be part of the culture. I've been doing this for about 23 years. I started in '96 in the Bay Area. My first company was the agency of record for PowerBar. We were the preferred provider for Netscape, which used to make a browser that's now called Mozilla, Firefox. We did things like the Olympics, where we had a million people a day coming to our site. I've run product and technology companies for companies like JDate, American Singles, where we have 1 million people a day coming to the site, get them married. And so it's I've kind of been doing this, but I've started 6 companies. I've raised venture for 2 of them, about $10 million. I bootstrapped or revenue funded the others. Back in 2011, I started a platform as a service right around the time Parse was created that ultimately got bought by Facebook, which was create a mobile app without really knowing how to build back-end code. They were Mongo based. We started about a year before them and just never had traction with the VCs to take off. But one of the things that happened was we had this desire to run code on our back ends and our front ends without giving them access to our servers. So tonight I'm going to talk about something called Adele. which stands for Agnostic Development Language. I'm going to give you a quick demo of what it is. It's been on a shelf for about 5 years, thanks to Mike. In conversations, I'm also the vice president of BendTech at the Tech Center, so we met one day and it kind of happenstance. I was like, hey, I'll dust off this code and check it out, because there was a need case for having people who didn't necessarily know how to write code that can run anywhere. Dusted it off and whoop, it worked. I'm going to give you a quick demo, show you what's next, and ask for a little bit of help. So Adele is what it's called is an agnostic development language. It's also called Adele, which is named after my daughter. The idea is that you write it once, you can run it anywhere. You can run it in the client, you can run it on the browser, you can run it in native, you can run it on the back end. It uses interpreters, it uses a metaphor similar to UML or traditional ways that people design user experience. So boxes and arrows. And then it's a palette-based IDE, so you've got things where you have palettes of variables and an info window and ways to select elements. All that comes together in basically a blob of code that you can take anywhere. It runs pretty quick. On the back end or front end, it can run in under 100 milliseconds for complicated operations. It's functional. It's not object-oriented today. It'll run on things like JavaScript in the browser. It'll run on Node. It'll run on Python, Ruby, Java. I didn't put C# up here because I hate it. But it will run there as well. That's what it looks like. So there's a palette of variables, there's an info window, and then you just literally line it up together and it spits out a directed graph in JSON. Why did we make it? Like I said, our first proof case was a company called Hitpost that got bought by Yahoo in 2014 for 8 figures. They needed to run social graph-based queries against our platform, where they didn't want to write any code to run on our side. We didn't want to give them access to our code or to our servers. So we started with this stack of what were called multiplex calls that ultimately got turned into Adele, where they needed to rapidly prototype, and they had about 100,000 people on their mobile app a day, and they needed to prove out their concept so that they could get some money from Google Ventures, and they did. They scaled it up, and then it got bought. We also validated it with Toyota and with a number of hackathons where you can build things very rapidly overnight to proof of concept. So build graphs using LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter, assemble activity feeds, login, simple stuff like that. But you didn't have to write any code, and you didn't have to deploy any service. It could just run somewhere that had an interpreter. So in late 2014, it worked into this fully functional, fully formed language. We wrapped the standard library around it, and we started using it more actively. And then in late 2015, I won the Toyota on-ramp, which was a multi-month business plan and prototype challenge that ultimately started my current business, which is a connected car company where we did our proof of concept to make people better drivers with Toyota in 2015, 16, and 17. And now we're productizing that, but I'm not going to talk about that right now. So what Adele is really is a JSON encoded directed graph. So it basically has paths that it executes along functionally interpreted in runtime. It's got visual meta associated with it. This is actual Adele. So you have meta associated with objects, whether they're variables or loops or if-thens or calls to rest or string format operations. Everything's there in the standard library that you would have in JavaScript or Python or Ruby or whatever. It's super portable. So as long as you have an interpreter, it'll run well, it'll run predictably, and it's fast. It's not perfect. It's not intended to be perfect. It's not first-class language. It's an interpreted language. It's kind of like good for people who don't know how to code, or you want to stick some glue together on something very rapidly. It's not the end-all, be-all, but it's better than what you can do by yourself with a bunch of lines of code in Sublime over a couple of hours. You can get this up and running in about 10 minutes. And it's not object-oriented today, so it's functional, it's procedural. That will be changing. So from that perspective, let me show you what it looks like. And let me know if I go too long. So I'm just going to get the BendJS site. We've created into a BendJS site. Right now it's wrapped into a Chrome plugin called Adele Composer, where if you want to edit a page and you want to add functionality to it, click the browser and then click the little thing in the Chrome. So this red means that there's something attached to it, which I'll show you later. But here there's nothing attached. You just can add simple interactions, and then this is the editor, the IDE. So over here you've got the variables, the palette, the info window that shows you what's going on. I'm literally just going to show you how to do an alert on click. So I'm going to go into there, I'm going to say, hey, using the window, I'm going to do an alert, say, hey, what's up? And then save and close, and I'm going to go through and preview that. And I'm going to click that, and hey, what's up? So all you have to do in order to do this, and have anybody you know who wants to write some interaction code, they can download this from the Google Chrome store. They can install it. It will be free for 30 days, and then there'll be a little monetization on top of it, like $5 a month. There'll be day passes where if you don't want to buy it for a month, monthly, it'll be like $1.99 for 24 hours, or you can buy like a monthly or a yearly, or maybe like $150 for an all life subscription. But then all you do in order to embed it is just you download the zip. Right now, this shows you it's fully baked in. So you actually have we have CDN backed support where the entire framework behind it is about 90K. And then everything else you just drop in with 2 lines of code that will come here. You drop this folder into the root. There's these 2 lines of code. You don't need this if you go to the CDN because it'll then work off of the embed code on the second line. And that's pretty much it. If you want to see something a little more complicated, you can come through here. And this is an if statement. So basically, you can create a variable. You've got if-then statements, so you can add additional cases to if-then statements. If something equals, if something doesn't equal, you just drag in variables. So there's global scope, there's local scope. You drag stuff in from palettes to the info palette. It then will export all this code for runtime, and it'll update your code and then re-embed it as you want to update your web page. So that's kind of it. You can also, if you share code on something like GitHub, the browser also will render out the GitHub source into Adele, so you can understand what the hell it's doing. But really, what it comes down to at the end of the day is this JSON. There's some positional information. So there's where is it X, Y on the canvas? How big are the elements? What are the IDs of the elements? What are they doing? What are the paths that they're taking? But it's really simple stuff. At the end of the day, it's a directed graph with just some annotation on the edges. So what's next? So the idea around this was really because of Mike and one other person that kind of got wind of it and it didn't shelve for so long. It's like, maybe there's something there. So I danced it around a little bit for the last couple of weeks, and there was a there. So I wrapped a 501c3 public benefit company around it, and I'm donating all of the spec and source and interpreting libraries into that corporation, that company, to open source and make it publicly available. So anybody can use the PHP or the Python or the Ruby or the Java or the C# code. You can improve it. You can make React bindings for it. Whatever you want to do. There's the next steps are really adding support for object orientation. More coverage for it doesn't support. So because this is 5 years old and the last time it was touched, there was no such thing as Angular. There was no such thing as Vue. There was no such thing as React. They're all new concepts, so this has there's no legacy there for it. So we would love some support there. And then the Composer plugin you'll be able to download in the web store. Unless you want it earlier, just hit me up and I'll send you an invite as a trusted tester on Google. You can try it out. It's exactly what I showed you right now. It's got bugs. Yeah, so it's going to launch. So the ask that I'm looking for is, would love some help with some feedback for the Chrome extension. If you wouldn't mind trying it out, give it a whirl. It'd be awesome. Take a look at the docs. What I didn't show you was the documentation is pretty robust. It's all at getadel.org. You can go through the documentation is pretty extensive. It's got samples you can download everywhere just by hitting the download button. You can go through and look at the standard library. It is a fully formed standard library. So, properties, operators, utilities, string functions. You can call the internet, make calls to REST endpoints, math, cryptography, anything you really want to do, you can do with this code. So I would love, take a look at this. If something sucks, let me know if it sucks. If it doesn't, tell me how it sucks.
These endpoints?
I'm sorry?
These endpoints, who's hosting those? Is that something you host yourself, or?
No, it's something you can call Meetup, you can call CodePen, you can call any endpoint you possibly want through Cores. So it's self-contained. There's you don't have to subscribe to our service. There is no service to subscribe to. It's just a spec, and then it's interpreted at however you want to use it. So it's a language. So I would love feedback on does this help you? Where does it not help you? how can it be useful to people who don't know how to write code? Because the idea here is that you can solve, the demo that we proved this out with was the Code Academy Introduction to JavaScript. And that takes, I think, 15 hours on Code Academy, and we were able to get through it in about 30 minutes using Adele. So you can just draw through it, and we have tutorials that were one-to-one matched with the Code Academy tutorial, but you can get through it in almost an order of magnitude of time. So less time. So I would love feedback on the documentation. And then if you know anybody else that would be interested in it, point them towards here, point them towards me. It's jason@adele.org. I would love the input. So that's it.
Hey Jason.
Yeah.
What do you see as the kind of end use case, or who is your target audience for using this?
So
prototyping or just...
Yeah, I think prototyping is a really sweet spot. So in town, there's, at least in BendTech, we have a ton of WordPress developers. So people who know how to stand up, WordPress widgets and don't necessarily know how to write code. So it's not necessarily like what Chris was saying about like a full stack or even a traditional or modern full front end developer, but somebody who's standing up has a design or is a designer and can kind of cut HTML and CSS, but has no idea how to wire up a button or do any kind of interaction. So that's a good use case. The other use case would be somebody who's like going into hackathons and wants to go prototype something rapidly and wants to be able to call things like Facebook and get stuff from the graph, call other endpoints that they might have sources for. So you have this really quick POC. It might be startups where you need to prototype something to see if there's a there before you waste dozens or hundreds of hours in development. You can stand it up in 30 minutes with us. So we were able to put together the LinkedIn, the Twitter, and the Facebook graph at a Top Coder hackathon in about 2 hours, and we took second place overnight in something where nobody else had code even comparable.
So the reason I ask is it reminds me a lot of like the adult version of Skit.
It's exactly Scratch.
Scratch.
Yeah.
By MIT. Have you thought about turning it into like a coding education?
Yeah, so we're actually going to donate 150 seats to OSU Cascades so that they can use it for either the business or for the computer science group, so that you can jumpstart your development, because it teaches you logic without having to be reliant on Python or JavaScript or whatever. But yeah, I think it's a good educational tool because it teaches you the core tenets of using a standard library-backed language without all of the shit that you have to do in order to learn how to write anything that you have to deploy. And you get to deploy to the web instantly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it would be a really great education tool.
Thanks. Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you.
David? Yep. All right.
All right, so this is building accessibility together from start to finish, looking at a real world kind of example project. And this is the lightning edition because I had to compress it from 30 minutes down to 10. So I'm David. I work at a digital agency called Dockyard that's fully distributed. And I manage the UX development team, which focuses on HTML, CSS, and accessibility. So as a quick overview, we're going to walk through an example project from design, markup with HTML, styling with CSS, functionality with JavaScript, and then finish out with testing to show how we can really incorporate accessibility from the start and not have it be something that's tacked on at the very end of a product development process. So we're going to build something really cool together. We're going to work on this imaginary app called Reads, and Reads is an app to help you find your next book. So we're designers, and we're going to start out with some thumbnail sketches. We're kind of thinking through the top navigation specifically for this app. And we're focused on the global search within the application. So we have this closed search, and when we open it, it's going to expand and cover up some of the surrounding top navigation links. We're thinking through how that'll work across different viewport sizes. So now we're ready to dive into the actual design files themselves. And at the mock-up stage, accessibility really starts at the very beginning. What I mean by that is if we adopt kind of an atomic design mentality and start at the most granular level of detail, I like to really think of these as like design tokens or particles. We can start considering accessibility from the very beginning. So we have our colors, and we want to make sure that we have sufficient color contrast throughout our application. So with our color palette, we have approved background and foreground combinations and their associated color contrast. We also have legible typography and making sure that our icons are legible as well. We can take these design tokens and start combining them into our simplest components or design atoms. So we're thinking about links and buttons, which already have to consider statefulness. So we document our default state, our hovered state, our focus state, so that keyboard users have wayfinding. And we're also thinking through the different states of our search input itself. So we have kind of a placeholder state, a focus state, the user is actively filling it out, and then what it looks like if they've already fully filled out the search form. So then we take these design atoms and we keep recomposing them, and those accessibility considerations are really paying off in dividends now, because we don't have to keep reinventing or accounting for all of this statefulness that we have to really keep track of. So we've taken those search inputs and we've put them in the context of the search form itself. And we repeat all of those same states of the search inputs, and now we're starting to think through some keyboard navigation patterns, like if the user moves focus to the submit button, or what if they want to close out this form. And then we can take these search forms and again, put them at another higher level of context, at the context of the center of our global header or top navigation. And at the highest level, we have now our organisms, or these really robust components that we set out to build. So we have our top navigation of our application here, and we're showing the closed and open state of our search form with all the various states that can take on, and also how the user might interact with it. And we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel or make a ton of separate mockups for this, because all of our components come along for that ride. So our designs are done, but there's some extra polish in terms of design documentation that we can do to make sure that developer handoff is really effective when it comes to accessibility. So the first thing that we can really do at this stage is predict needs for hidden text, visually hidden text that provides a audio alternative for anything that's typically visual only in its experience. So as an example, we have this magnifying glass icon, and contextually we need to have some hidden text of open search, so that if users who don't have the ability of sight focus on this button, they really understand what this button is supposed to do. Similarly, we also have a hidden label for our search input, and we have additional button text for the submit button and the close button as well. Another form of design documentation that we can do for accessibility at this stage is to start thinking through our keyboard navigation pattern, or the tab stops, and kind of evaluate the flow as users move through this component. So we have the focus on the first step here set on the open search button. They open it up, they fill out their search, and they might close it. We return focus back to where they were inside of this top navigation. So with all this great documentation, it's now time to build. And so we're going to get hyped up, we're going to crack open the text editor, and we're going to start with just markup. And I can't emphasize this enough. We really want to focus on just HTML at this stage. And that's going to have a few distinct benefits. Let's imagine that CSS isn't even a thing when we start building this out. And a couple key things to call out at this stage is that we're going to really take advantage of semantic HTML and really think through an intelligent document structure for the component that we're going to build. So looking at our simple header markup here, we have semantic HTML. We're also using ARIA attributes when appropriate, but we're very careful in using them. So ARIA attributes are basically ways to enhance your HTML in the ways that it renders to assistive technology. So you can add some functionality, you can add some semantics with it, but it's really powerful, so a lot of times people actually overuse ARIA and it damages the user experience. So we're very careful in our use of ARIA. Lastly, we don't have too much HTML that's there just for styling purposes. So we have a single div just to group some of the elements together, but we don't see div-itis or div soup just spilling all over our markup, because we want to focus on that semantic clean structure. So a couple other details at the markup stage. We want to really leverage native semantic links and buttons and not try to take a link and try to make it into a button, which I see all the time, and we definitely don't want to use divs and start wiring up click handlers and trying to fake the functionality of divs and buttons, because they have a lot of semantics and a lot of inherent accessibility that we would ditch if we didn't use them. Next up, we want to think about the screen reader DOM. It has basically its own DOM that interprets the structure of the document. And a mistake people often make is they learn about things like ARIA labels and they want to label everything possible. But we have to really carefully think about this. So in this example, we have a button that's just a visual icon, and we've slapped an ARIA label of search icon on there. But a screen reader will hear this as open search icon, and it just becomes really clunky, really redundant. So this is a great example of, you might have visually hidden text, but then on the screen reader side, you might actually hide some extraneous content, like hiding the actual SVG itself with ARIA hidden true, so that screen readers never really acknowledge that content as being important. And the last thing is, any interactive component or element, we really want to have an associated accessible name. We have to give it some sort of label or context to what its function is really for. So in our search input itself, we have a visually hidden label, and that contextualizes what that input is for. So this is our project so far. It looks great. We have just raw HTML, so we're not quite done. But there's a lot of cool things going on here. We're tabbing through this interface. We already have focus styles by default with the browser. There's already some native styles obviously coming along for the ride. And if we were to wire things up with JavaScript, it's actually an accessible experience. So let's move on to the styling stage. And there's a critical thing at this stage that is a common pitfall. And to avoid that pitfall, we have to make sure we really stick with that plan. So we invested so heavily in making sure our designs were really accessible, and we want to make sure we really honor that at the styling stage. And there's a couple things here, a couple common mistakes to avoid. The first is when handling that hidden text, don't use display none, because that'll actually obliterate it for all users, sighted and non-sighted as well. So instead, reach for something like a screen reader only utility that visually hides it and doesn't affect layout, but it makes it accessible to assistive technologies. The next thing is to also not obliterate your focus styles, and I see this so much. People throw on an outline none because it doesn't match their visual aesthetic. But what you're doing is, imagine if you're a keyboard user, it's the equivalent of not being able to see your mouse cursor at all, so it makes it impossible to really know where you are on the page. Instead, we can provide custom focus styles that match our brand, match our aesthetic, and there's a great opportunity for some micro animations and interactions there as well. Another detail is handling heights of components or containers. So if we use the height property on its own and set it to a hard-coded pixel value, and the user wants to zoom in and out of their interface or change the root font size of the browser, that text might wrap or bump to a new line and cause overflow and a lot of chaos. And in that case, it can be really hard to read, or you won't be able to guarantee sufficient color contrast. So instead, use min height for your containers, and things will scale proportionally with that interface. Similar to that, the units of measurement in our CSS are really critical. So we don't want to hard code things like font sizes or even dimensions with pixels, because users who might want to change their base font size to something bigger than 16 pixels, that may not be respected if we do this. So instead we use rem, or the responsive M unit, for all of our dimensions, and everything scales proportionally and really respects the user's needs. So at the styling stage, we have all of our statefulness in place here. So we have our hover states, our focus states, and things are really starting to come along. But we still need to wire up this component to work as expected. So moving on to the functionality stage, let's bring in some JavaScript. And with custom UI patterns, it can be really confusing to know how to make them accessible. So one statement of encouragement is to really refer to existing design patterns. What I mean by that is look at common custom UI patterns like modal dialogues, accordions, tab panels, etc. And a really good reference for this is Dave Rupert's accessibility nutrition cards, and it lists out all the accessibility and keyboard support requirements for these really common patterns. So looking at our designs again, we have this search component, and when it's collapsed, it's just this icon. When it's expanded, it overlays and it obscures some content underneath. And so this is kind of a unique situation, but this is essentially a modal pattern of sorts, because we're overlaying on top of content, we're obscuring something beneath. And so looking back at our design documentation, we can now look at the functionality that's needed for focus management, or how we're going to move focus through this component when users are interacting with it. So again, at that first stop, they focus on that open search button. When they open it, we move focus into the search input so they can start typing right away. If they want to submit, they tab once more to the submit button or can continue to a close button. If they're not ready to close it though, we actually are going to cycle focus or trap it within the search component so they can't accidentally be trying to focus elements that are hidden beneath this component. And once they've closed this component using the keyboard, we're going to return focus back to that original button so they can continue in a logical order from where they left off. So now with all of our functionality in place, we have our focus management in place and all of our focus styles, we have the visual fidelity that we're going for, and so a lot of that accessibility is all in place now. And the last step here is to really test your work for accessibility in a couple different ways. So the first way to test is automated testing. We have things like the Lighthouse audits. We have WebAIM and Axe and a few other plugins or websites that can really audit it quickly. And they generate a really handy report of things that are passing accessibility criteria, things that are failing with some recommendations. And important to note here, it also recommends things to manually check because automated testing can't catch everything. So the simplest way to manually check your work for accessibility is to use that keyboard. Start hitting the tab key and look for things like focus states. Make sure the tab order makes sense, that it's intuitive with what you see visually presented on the page. To go one step further, don't be afraid to boot up an actual screen reader. You can use VoiceOver on Mac, which comes built in. If you're on Windows, you can use NVDA, which is open source. And boot up a screen reader and start interacting with your content. And at the bottom left, you'll see that it's going to read the content out to you, and you can really evaluate if it makes sense. I would really recommend you closing your eyes completely and seeing if you can use the website as you'd expect. And perhaps the most important form of testing is user testing, because when it comes to accessibility, users have a wide array of needs. So everybody uses different assistive technologies. They have different levels of ability. So get it in front of the eyes of users, or get in front of your users, and make sure that it works for their specific needs. So with all that said, in less than 10 minutes, we built out this component, and because we incorporated accessibility from the start, it's not something that's tacked on at the end. It doesn't cost extra time in our estimations, and we didn't really compromise on the user experience as a result. So obviously this component is by no means perfect, it doesn't cover everything, but this is just one simple focused example of how we can really make it a natural part of the development process. So that's all I got.
Thanks, guys. Well, we went a little over our time, but thanks everyone for sticking around. Some great talks. Thanks everyone who gave a talk. And like we said, we'll have the next couple meetups posted here fairly soon. As always, if anyone else wants to give a presentation, you have something interesting to talk about, whether a lightning talk or a full talk, hit us up on Slack. We're always looking for new people and kind of new ideas, new things to share. So. We'll have those other things posted soon. Get ready for the social in December. Yeah, that's about it. And remember, if you ever can't make a meetup, we're going to start doing the live stream consistently, so you'll be able to actually watch it or watch the videos afterwards on our YouTube channel.
But it's way cooler to show up to social.
Yep.